point in our afternoon, I'd like to invite Professor Glendon here and Father Peter, our president, to confer the Civitas Dei.
Okay. Professor Mary Ann Glendon is the learned Hand Professor of Law at Harvard University and the former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. She currently serves on the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom and the Board of Directors of the Institute of Religious Works, Vatican Bank. She is a member of the board of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and a consultant for the United States Bishops' Committee on Religious Freedom. She writes and teaches in the fields of human rights, comparative law, constitutional law, property law, and political theory. Professor Glendon is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, serving as president from 2004 to 2014, the International Academy of Comparative Law, and is past president of UNESCO's sponsored International Association of Legal Science. She served 2 terms as a member of the United States President's Council on Bioethics, 2001 to 2004. Professor Glendon has contributed to legal and social thought in several articles and books. Her widely translated works, bringing a comparative approach to a variety of subjects, include The Form and the Tower, 2011, a series of biographical essays on exploring the relation between political philosophy and politics in action. Traditions in Turmoil, 2006, a collection of essays on law, culture, and human rights. A World Made New, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 2011, a study of the framing of the UDHR, A Nation Under Lawyers. A Nation Under Lawyers, 1996, a portrait of turbulence in the legal profession, analyzing the implications of change in legal culture for a democratic policy that entrusts critical roles to legally trained men and women. Finally, The Right Talk, 1991, a critique of the impoverishment of political discourse. Professor Glendon will speak on religious freedom in a secular age. I don't know where you find time to do all of this, but...
I've lived a long time.
You look great. But the power vested in me by the Board of Trustees for your lifetime of work in promoting the Catholic intellectual tradition, I confer upon you, Mary Ann Glendon, the Civitas Dei Medal for 2014.
And a very beautiful medal it is. Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh my goodness. Please. Please. I'm quite overwhelmed. I'm so touched that Professor Lyons and Father McCartney took the trouble to read some of my writings and to zero, what more could a teacher ask than that you zeroed in on things that are so close to my heart. I am so grateful to you. But you put me in a difficult position because now how am I ever going to live up to all the nice things that these people have said about me? Since we're in a political season, I can say that it reminds me of something Herbert Humphrey once said after someone had given him a very flowery introduction. And he said, well, thank you for that introduction. I only wish my mother and father could have been here to hear it because my father would have been proud and my mother would have believed it. So I'm more honored than I can say to receive this Civitas Dei Award. And by the way, I'm so grateful to know how it's pronounced because this is one of those areas where the pronunciation of the C in Latin is much disputed. But I like the Italian, like Civitas Dei, that's very nice. I'm very honored and I'm very grateful to Barbara Wall for accepting my request and even encouraging me to use this opportunity to speak about a problem that has been very much on my mind for the past 3 years, during which I've been serving as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom. The problem is a growing challenge for us commissioners. One of my fellow commissioners is here today, Villanova's own Daniel Ian Mark. It's a challenge. I don't know if you've, I don't want to discourage Professor Mark, who's a new member of the commission, but it's a serious challenge for anyone who is a religious freedom advocate to be defending religious freedom in what the first recipient of this Civitas Dei award, Charles Taylor, called a secular age. And I'll say right out exactly what I think the problem is, and I'll be interested maybe in the question and answer to have you convince me that I have painted too gloomy a picture. I am half Irish and half Yankee Congregationalist, and so we do have a tendency to see the dark cloud behind every silver lining. But I'm working on being more Italian, so, okay. The clearest way I can put the problem is this, or my fear, I should say, my worry is that religious freedom is currently pretty far along in the process of being demoted from a fundamental right to one of many competing interests that is all too easily subordinated to other rights, claims, and interests. Now, I can imagine that fear might strike some people as exaggerated. After all, religious freedom is still right up there at the head of our Bill of Rights. It has been accepted, at least formally, by nearly every country in the world in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the many documents that are modeled on it. But it seems to me that there are too many signs to ignore that concrete commitment to international religious freedom or domestic religious freedom is weakening. And ironically, this weakening of support is occurring just at a time when religious freedom is under severe assault, violently in some parts of the world, many parts of the world, and more subtly in the liberal democracies of the West. And the second irony is that this weakening of support is taking place just as social science evidence is beginning to accumulate about positive correlation between religious freedom and many other social goods. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Now, since much of what I will say is based on my experience on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, as Professor Mark knows, I am required by Commission rules to say that I do not represent the views of the Commission, that everything that I will say represents my personal views and opinions. So let me begin with a personal view, or rather a personal recollection. I must say that when I was a young lawyer in the 1960s and doing pro bono work in the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the furthest thing from my mind was that religious freedom would one day have declining support in the United States. With the passage of time, many people seem to have forgotten how much of the energy that fueled that movement and sustained that movement sprang directly from religious sources. The very public ministry of Martin Luther King galvanized, touched the hearts of many people who had not given much thought to the shame of segregation. And some of you, maybe there's some people in this room who can remember when Archbishop Rummel of New Orleans excommunicated 4 powerful Louisiana political leaders for opposing integration of the schools. The positive role of religion in public life in that period was so evident and so palpable that I would have been astonished if anyone had told me that one day expanded definitions of civil rights would come into sharp conflict with religious freedom. Yet clearly that day is here. A telling sign, I think, is that Reverend Martin Luther King is now commonly referred to as Dr. King. And religious freedom is now at the center of many legal and political controversies, domestic and international. Hardly a day goes by. Barbara Wall was just telling me about a dreadful story of a whole family being killed simply because it was thought that they had somehow disrespected a holy book. Hardly a day goes by when there is not some shocking story involving life and death, involving religious freedom. The Pew Foundation tells us that those violent incidents are on the rise, and in fact, right now, that they are at a 6-year high. Less violent infringements, more subtle, more insidious infringements of religious liberty are what we see in the liberal democracies of the West or westernized countries, that all of these countries that traditionally regarded religious freedom as one of the first, if not the very first, of freedoms. And what seems to me to be especially worrying about the future of religious freedom is that there are also signs that religious freedom, that less importance is being attached to religious freedom in one of the places where one might have thought it was most secure, namely in the minds and hearts of citizens of the liberal democracies. So clearly something seems to be happening. I'd be very happy if you tell me my fears are exaggerated. Perhaps you'll tell me I need to get out of the People's Republic of Cambridge more often. But I will mention just 4 developments that seem to point to declining support, both official and social, for the broad concept of religious freedom that is enshrined in our First Amendment and in international documents. The first is the difficulty that we experience on the Commission all the time of persuading political decision makers here and abroad to pay attention to the dramatic increase in the worst forms of religious freedom violations. According to the latest report from the Pew Research Center, 76% of all the people in the world live in countries where there are severe religious freedom, high to severe is their language, high to severe restrictions on religious freedom. 76%, that's over 3/4 of the people in the world. If that seems impossible to you, think of the fact that many of those countries are very populous. That would include China and India, for example. The situation seems to be getting worse. I don't have to go into the whole catalog. You can think of the depredations of Boko Haram in Nigeria. You can think of the situation of Christians and desperate plight of Christians in many parts of the Middle East, Yazidis and Christians in Iraq, Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. It just goes on and on. The evidence is so massive that one would expect that the governments that are committed to the principles in the Universal Declaration would show increased vigor in addressing these violations. Yet the opposite seems to be true. Just a couple months ago, on September 18, Thomas Farr, who directs Georgetown University's Institute on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, he testified before Congress, and he said that, and I'm quoting him here, "The United States has had no impact on the global rise of religious persecution." No impact. And Katrina Sweat, the chairwoman of our commission, testified on the same day that a bureaucratic culture in the State Department, quote, has tended to sideline these concerns under both Republican and Democratic administrations. In fact, remarkably, the US State Department in 2012 decided to drop religious freedom from its list of rights in its annual report on religious and human rights throughout the world. It dropped religious rights from its list of human rights. Their official explanation was they wanted to avoid duplication of effort, but it's not very convincing because the same officials speak of redoubled efforts when they are addressing violations of matters that they consider to be of higher priority. So it looks as though the decision to drop religious freedom is of a piece with other indications of a low priority for religious freedom, like the tendency on the part of many government officials, instead of saying religious freedom or free exercise of religion, to say freedom of belief or freedom of worship, which narrows the definition of religious liberty and represents a departure from the traditional understanding, both in the Universal Declaration and in our constitutional law, of free exercise as encompassing not only belief but behavior, not only in private but in public, not only alone but in association with others. I certainly don't want to suggest that the United States is alone in this respect. A 2013 report from a group of concerned British parliamentarians refers to religious freedom as an orphan right, and they say that it is becoming a residual right that is protected only to the extent, I'm quoting, that it does not stand in the way of some other goal or ambition. Now let me come to a second sign of declining support for religious freedom, which is more in the news here in the United States these days, and that is the erosion of conscience protection for religious individuals and institutions. Sometimes these inroads on conscience protection are successfully resisted, as in the recent Hobby Lobby case, where a family-owned company won the right to be exempted from a federal requirement that would have required it to participate in supplying abortifacient or insurance for abortifacient drugs to its employees. But such victories require a tremendous litigation effort. And that is why so many institutions simply do not contest such regulations and simply leave the field, as Catholic Charities in Illinois and Massachusetts did when government regulations would have required them to place children with same-sex couples. They said they conscientiously could not do that, and they had to go out of the adoption business, which they had prosecuted so successfully for over 100 years. I've taken those examples from the experience in the United States, but they are reflective of many, many similar examples in the other liberal democracies. Now, I'd come very briefly to a third sign of the times, which is, again, more familiar to us in the academic world, what seems to be an increasingly aggressive hostility to religion among opinion leaders, especially in the academy and in the media. There's nothing new about disdain for religion in those quarters, but what seems to be new is a new lack of civility, especially on the part of persons who regard traditional ideas about human sexuality as obstacles to human liberation, and who treats anyone who holds traditional ideas on those topics as motivated by bias rather than good faith belief. So those attitudes, and you lawyers will be aware of these articles, those attitudes are so prevalent in the legal academy that many very well-known constitutional scholars, well, I shouldn't say maybe, I guess I would count three. I would count three constitutional scholars who have written articles saying that religious freedom is a redundant right. We don't need it because everything important that it covers is covered by anti-discrimination laws and freedom of expression and association. Fourth and finally, I mentioned that there are signs that the status of religion in popular culture is not so secure as many suppose. Well, nobody really knows what goes on in another person's mind or heart, but there are some objective signs that this is so. According to the Pew Foundation, the two most striking trends in recent years in the area of what people, religious practices and what people say about their religious beliefs are the trend to say they are religious but not affiliated with any organized religion, and the trend to say they are spiritual but not religious. In some respects, the current situation in the United States seems to me to be similar to a paragraph that I ran across in reading Tocqueville on the old regime and the French Revolution, where he says that in the 18th century in France, religious irreverence, which in my university, that's a compliment. If you say someone's irreverent, that's supposed to be really hot stuff. So Tocqueville says, religious irreverence, I'm going to read you the quote, became fashionable, and here's an insertion in the quote. He says it became fashionable among elites and it trickled down, that's not his word, but it's what he's saying, trickled down into the popular culture where he says, quote, it was replaced by a whole, religion was replaced by a whole host of new loyalties and secular ideals, while many who retained their beliefs became fearful of being alone in their allegiance and kept silent or pretended to share the sentiments of the others. I think that could be written in Massachusetts today. He contrasted that state of affairs with what he saw in the United States on his visit here in the 1830s. He saw and described for his fellow Frenchmen a country where biblical faith and democratic habits and practices seemed to be hand in hand and mutually reinforcing. So, if those four trends that I have just mentioned, those four signs of the times, if they are real, then here's a puzzle. How did religious freedom go from the status of a right that was formally, at least, recognized as fundamental in practically every country in the world, to a right that seems to be in the process of being marginalized and downgraded, even by the civilizations that once championed it? How did that come about? I think some light was shed on the answer to that question by the first recipient of the Civitas Dei Award, Charles Taylor, in his massive book titled A Secular Age. Has anybody read that book all the way through? 884 pages, okay. You and I. All right. Well, it's well worth reading. And I'm going to give you just a thumbnail sketch. Big thumbnail. So Taylor puts the emphasis on the cultural changes that took place in the late 20th century, at least in the Western or Westernized countries. And he says that there has been a titanic change in the social context in which religion is lived. I'm going to be quoting a lot here. He cites the decline in religious practice. He cites the fact that public spaces have been largely emptied of religious references. And he says, quote, we have moved from a society where belief in God is mostly unchallenged to one in which it is understood to be one opinion among others. What makes our age secular, he says, is that the lives of fewer people are influenced by religious beliefs, or to put it another way, that religious believers in the West are no longer embedded in and sustained by a religion-saturated culture. Now, to get Taylor's take on just when and why that happened, you have to read nearly to the end of the book. And as you get toward the end, I'd be interested to know if you had the same impression that I did. you get toward the end, and it's as though he doesn't want to reach the conclusion that his analysis is taking him to. And he circles around for about another 100 pages. And then he says, well, as to the when, the 1960s were the key moment when there arose, and here I'll quote, a generalized culture of expressive individualism in which people were encouraged to find their own way, discover their own fulfillment, and do their own thing. The other day, when I was watching Mayor Menino of Boston, watching his funeral on television, at the end of the funeral, as they processed out of the church with the casket, what do you suppose the song was that accompanied him? This seems to be a song that is very popular with the aging generation of the 60s, popular for funerals. Yes, Father McCartney got it. I did it my way. Now, I don't know, I can see Tom Menino thinking, I'm a self-made guy, and he wanted that song. But I have to say that, if you're a person who thinks we're going to be judged, that might not be, just as your lawyer, I would say to you, probably you would not want to say, I did it my way. You might say, I tried to do it your way, but sometimes it didn't work out. Anyway, all right, back to Charles Taylor. So as to the why, he gets to the when in the 1960s. Then he circles around for a while and he says, well, there'll be a variety of causes. This is why people hate sociology, because everything has many causes. But then when he gets to the implications for religion, he eventually brings himself to say the following. The heart of this revolution lies in sexual mores. And the pursuit of individual self-fulfillment at all costs, particularly in sexual matters, has caused more and more people to fall away from the churches that uphold rigorous standards of sexual morality. The generations which have been formed in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s are in some respects deeply alienated from a strong traditional model of Christian faith in the West. That's end of quote. In other words, the very period when some of us saw the civil rights movement as, and thank you, Beth, for bringing this out so beautifully, the very period when some of us saw the civil rights movement as about expanding the inclusiveness of the community to which we all belong, this was, and maybe not all of us at the time focused on this, but as Taylor says, this was also the period when individual self-expression was becoming an overriding value, and individual rights, especially those having to do with human sexuality, were on the way to becoming important rights. So if Taylor's narrative is basically right, the shift from a rights movement that was about inclusiveness in a community to rights claims aimed at maximizing individual autonomy, that poses, to my mind, what is the single greatest challenge for our American version of the democratic experiment, and that is this. How do we hold together the two halves of the divided soul of the American polity, our love of individual freedom and our sense of a community for which we all bear a common responsibility? And I'm so grateful that you zeroed in on exactly that part of that writing over the years where I see this as a constant, not that there's going to be a definite answer to it, but it's something that we must struggle with. We can't fall into collectivism on the one hand, we can't fall into radical hyper-individualism on the other. Now, I can't pretend to have an answer to the question that I posed, but there is an interesting body of work that I mentioned at the outset of this talk. There's an interesting body of work that I think at least helps to dispel some of the myths that cloud our thinking about such issues, or to put it maybe in a more positive way, that helps us to think more clearly about these issues. So, for example, the Pew Foundation is generating a lot of research that shows a positive correlation, and yes, I understand correlation is not causation, but a positive correlation between religious freedom in a society and other important goods, such as the longevity of democracy, the presence of civil and political liberty, women's advancement, press freedom, literacy, lower infant mortality, and economic freedom. And still other studies, here I'm thinking of my colleague Robert Putnam at Harvard, are showing a positive relationship between religion in a society and civic virtue in the society, something that Tocqueville postulated. But now there is more data suggesting that regular worshipers are more likely to donate money to charity, volunteer service to charity, give blood, spend time with a person who's depressed, return excess change to a salesperson, help a neighbor, be active in civic activities, and to belong to community organizations. So that's the sociologists. Meanwhile, over among the political scientists or the political theorists, there's some other interesting material coming out, mostly in Europe, I would say. Material that supports what George Washington famously said in his farewell address, that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, said Washington, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Tocqueville said the same thing. When he came here in the 1830s, he wrote to his friends in France, "Lovers of liberty," he said to his fellow sons of the Enlightenment. "Lovers of liberty, hasten to call religion to your aid, for you must know that the reign of freedom cannot be established without the aid of mores," by which he meant the general culture, and that religion is the guardian of the mores. Now, that claim, those claims by Tocqueville and Washington are, as you know, disputed in today's political science, political theory world, where there are many people who say a liberal democracy can get along very well without religion. And in fact, many of the same people will say religion is a prime source of discord, and that our regime itself contains within itself the resources that it needs to produce the kinds of citizens and statesperson that this very demanding form of government requires. Now, to be sure, there have always been a number of writers in the United States who've taken the contrary view, such as myself, but since so many of them, including myself, are identified with a particular religious tradition, it's very easy, and it often happens, that this line of argument from those of us who are part of a religious tradition is dismissed as special pleading. That's quite understandable. So I find it particularly interesting that Jürgen Habermas, who is a self-described atheist, a man of the left, and probably Europe's most famous living philosopher, Jürgen Habermas and the Italian philosopher-statesman Marcello Pera are now challenging the notion. As professed non-believers, they are challenging the notion that a liberal state, a liberal regime, can afford for its own good to be indifferent or hostile to religion. And both of them, as atheists, have raised their voices in favor of religion in the public square. In Habermas's case, Father McCarthy, it was concern about biological experimentation and about the instrumentalization of human life that led him to that conclusion. He stunned his philosophers a few years ago when he came to say, and I'll quote, "Secular citizens do not have the right to deny on principle a potential truth in the religious ideas of the world, or to contest the right of religious citizens to contribute to public discussion." The example that I find even more astonishing is, if you can imagine this, in 2008, the president of France, the then president Nicolas Sarkozy, gave a speech in which he said, we should accept a positive form of secularism. Now, keep in mind that the French Constitution establishes secularism as, it establishes France as a secular state, laïque. That would be the way you would translate. So he says, but we have to embrace a concept of positive secularism, which is marked by, I'm quoting here, respect for religion and its public role, and a posture of neutrality that opens up areas of freedom for persons of all faiths. Now, given that France is the very cradle of modern established secularism, it's quite remarkable for a French president to say these things. He went on to say, we would be crazy. No, he said, it would be crazy to deprive ourselves of religion. Quite simply, it would be a failing against culture, against thought. A positive secularism offers our consciences the possibility of dialogue above and beyond our beliefs and rights concerning the meaning we want to give to our lives. Remarkable stuff. But a kind of fear, I think, in Europe about what would life be like if there were no more Christians. Well, only time will tell whether anything will come of those straws in the wind, and meanwhile, religious liberty continues to be under assault. Here are the questions that trouble me, that I ask myself as a commissioner on international religious freedom. And here, I would say, Commissioner Mark, these are the questions I think that are the most perplexing for us. How can people in a secular age, what Taylor calls a secular age, how can people in a secular age be convinced of the importance of protecting religious freedom? I mean, that's a big obstacle. If you're on a commission that's supposed to protect a certain important human right, and you can't even get people's attention for it, that's a big problem. And then I think back about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when people who had never personally experienced segregation nevertheless came to really take to heart that they didn't want to live in a country where this was going on. They wanted to do something about it. How can we convince people who have never personally experienced religious persecution that this is something that is worth defending, both from the most violent assaults and also from more subtle intrusions? So, problem of rhetoric, problem of logic, I don't know. It does seem to me that there are some starting points as we try to talk to people who are unconvinced about these things. There are some starting points that are relatively uncontroversial. And one is that no serious person disputes that religious freedom has to be harmonized with other important rights. I mean, we live in a liberal democratic polity, and that's a small L liberal, okay? Political scientists accepted terminology, right? We live in a liberal democratic polity, small d democratic, where we have rights that often are bumping up against each other. They have to be harmonized. So it's a challenge. Lawyers are supposed to be good at that sort of thing. But what you don't do is read one of them out of the book. You try to harmonize them in such a way that each of them can have the fullest play as possible. So that's one thing I think is relatively uncontroversial. No serious person would dispute that religious freedom, like any other right, has limits for the public health and safety. That's fairly uncontroversial. And that's explicit in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No fair-minded person is in favor of unjust discrimination against any person or group. But of course, the devil, as they say, is in the details. And as to those details, again, I don't have an answer. I have a couple of thoughts that I think could be helpful in thinking about these issues. One having to do with the legislative process in our increasingly regulatory state, and the other to do with how judges decide cases. So my first suggestion concerns those cases where to comply with a law would cause a person to violate his or her religious faith. In this country, we have a long tradition dating way back even before the Constitution, a long tradition of granting religious exemptions from generally applicable laws. And it's a tradition that is based on two values. One is the celebration of diversity of a population as a reflection of the conviction that a tolerant and heterogeneous society is better and richer for its diversity, for its pluralism. In other words, pluralism is linked with freedom. If you have freedom, you have pluralism. And the second idea, I think, behind this practice of granting religious exemptions is that it's respect for individual liberty. It's the idea that the law should not force people to violate their most deeply held religious beliefs without a very good reason. And that's the idea that's at the heart of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act says, yes, government sometimes can and must burden religious freedom, but it can only do so if two conditions are met. One, if there is a compelling governmental interest, and secondly, if the means chosen is the least restrictive means of furthering that interest. Well, that, I would argue that approach has served this country well in the past, and this is not the moment to throw it overboard. My other suggestion concerns the judicial process in those cases where, as often happens, religious rights are in conflict with, or at least tension with, some other rights or some other interests and claims. And there, I would hope that as the courts struggle with those cases, as they increasingly will and are doing now, I would hope they would do so in the spirit of one of our wisest judges, in fact, somebody who'd be a good candidate for the Civitas Dei Award, Guido Calabresi, former dean of the Yale Law School, now a judge emeritus on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Here's a wonderful thing he wrote about how a judge should go about deciding a case. You know, in law, it's usually all or nothing, and he writes this about how a judge should go about deciding a case where one side is going to be very disappointed. Here's what he says. A decision which recognizes the values on the losing side as real and significant tends to keep us from becoming callous with respect to the beliefs that lose out. This gives the losers hope that the values they cherish will not ultimately be abandoned by the society. It tells the losers that though they lost, they and their values do carry weight and are recognized in our society even when they don't win out. In other words, it treats them as citizens of the polity and not as emarginated bigots or unassimilated immigrants. Now, I think that's beautiful. The judge for whom my chair at Harvard is named, Learned Hand, once wrote that in his opinions, he always addressed the opinion to the losing party and to the judge who was being overruled. If a judge, to let them know, at least to give them the sense that their point of view had been considered and why the judge thought it was fair not to accept their arguments. I think it's a wonderful way to approach the judicial process. So because I agree with Judge Calabresi on the importance of doing everything you can to maintain civility in this heterogeneous society of ours, and because I agree with Charles Taylor on the priority of culture, I'm going to conclude with a few thoughts about whether I think religious freedom can regain something of its status as a fundamental right. My first thought is this, that whether that can happen will depend to some extent, but only to some extent, on all the efforts that activists, government commissioners like Professor Mark and myself. To some extent, it will depend on all those activities. But, and here is, I think, my main point, what will be decisive for the preservation of religious liberty in the end will be the behavior of religious believers and religious leaders. They're the ones who have the responsibility to educate their followers to the responsible exercise of religious freedom. They're the ones who need to find ways to advance their religiously grounded moral viewpoints in public in a way that is intelligible to all men and women of goodwill. They're the ones who have to reject ideologies that would manipulate religion for political purposes or use religion as a pretext for violence. They're the ones who have to search for resources within their own traditions for promoting mutual respect and tolerance. And it's up to them to resist the divide and conquer strategies that, if successful, could install an intolerant secularism as the official religion. Those are formidable challenges, but I don't want to leave on a Jansenist or Calvinist note, even though that is my heritage. As I said, I'm trying to become Italian. So some good news is that these rising threats that are darkening the world's religious landscape, they are unifying persons of all faiths and no faiths in a way that is quite surprising and quite encouraging. Friends of religious liberty have large resources at their disposal of education, public witness, interfaith collaboration. I think these are good times for that. And all this gives me reason to hope that the United States might become, once again, what it once was, an example, a living example of a society where persons of many faiths can not only coexist, but can flourish. Thank you very much. Do you want to handle the questions?
Sure. We'll take a few questions. Thank you very much, Professor Glendon. It's an extraordinary opportunity for all of us. On a personal note, I want to also thank you for the years that you have helped me so much with our Journal of Catholic Social Thought. You're on the editorial board, and the times at which you were very helpful also in securing some particular articles for us. So we're delighted with that. Professor Glendon will respond to any questions that you might have. We have a number of lawyers here.
Thank you very much for the outstanding talk. I was wondering, this is not to the fundamental points that you were making, but the French case was very surprising. And Sarkozy's a politician, and so he might have lots of political motives. Or I was wondering what your read is on that. I think the most cynical explanation that I can come up with is the wave of immigration in France that has brought a lot of strong religious feeling with it, and whether that wasn't, if I want to be really, not an endorsement necessarily of the kind of views that you and I might share about the importance of religion in the public square, but instead kind of a sop to a community that he thinks he needs to appeal to in order to be viable.
Yeah, certainly I would not, well, of course, as I've said before in this talk, nobody knows what really goes on in another person's mind or heart, and certainly no one knows what really goes on in the mind and heart of a politician. But I wouldn't exclude that as a very plausible, from a purely political point of view, very plausible explanation. But then the way he said it, and the weight of that terminology in a country that says this is a lay state, and the way he says we have to think about laïcité in a different way. Whatever motivated him to say it, and he said it on the occasion of the visit of Pope Benedict to the Collège des Bernardins. Again, you might say, well, maybe there are reasons to please Pope Benedict, reasons to please persons in France's increasingly heterogeneous society. But nevertheless, it's really, I think, a significant turn. And he did go on and on about it in a way that, and so why do I not totally dismiss it as political? Because here's quite remarkable thing, a hopeful sign. About a year ago, our U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom was contacted by a member of the House of Lords in Britain who was getting together a group of British parliamentarians, a small group, but an interfaith group, that was concerned about the declining status of religious freedom. They're the ones who wrote the article that I mentioned that called religious freedom the orphan right. And they asked us from our commission to come over and discuss what our commission does with them. So that was a year ago. Tomorrow, I'm going to Oslo to meet with them and representatives of 23 other parliaments from Europe and South America who want to do something about the declining status of religious freedom, and who, when they talk about it, are not talking about, certainly the Latin Americans are not talking about internal problems that European states have. They're just horrified by what's going on in Nigeria, in the Middle East, in Myanmar. I mean, these slaughters that are, and the silence of the liberal democracies of Europe and North America and South America on that subject, the relative silence. So I take your point, and I don't disagree with it, but I think we can hope for a little bit more oomph from all this.
Because it seems to me that in some senses it broadens it. When you have people like Justice Scalia making speeches saying that freedom of religion meant freedom for churches and not freedom for those who didn't want to belong to a church. And it seems to me freedom of belief encompasses both groups.
Well, sure it does. And this is why in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they speak of freedom of religion and belief. And then they go on to say, in public or in private, alone or with others. Because if you just say freedom of belief, then if it's only a freedom that you can do in your own room, that really opens up a huge scope for governmental restriction on what we in our tradition call free exercise.
One last question. We do have a wonderful reception outside where you can also talk more informally with Professor Glendon. Yes, Vincent.
Maybe you could help me through this thicket with the religious institution versus the religion or the practice of the people in the religion. The question of contraception and insurance that includes access to contraception. There have been instances where institutions have tried to claim that their religious freedom is violated if they have to provide insurance for contraception. They're not speaking in it, as we well know, the practice of Roman Catholics is the same as everyone else in the United States statistically in terms of the practice of contraception. And so it does not really represent Catholic people. To some extent, it represents the official position of an institution. How does one find one's legal way through that thicket?
Well, I think first I want to say that my impression is that what most people find most troublesome about the Health and Human Services regulation is the abortifacient drugs. I think that's, and that was the ground on which the Hobby Lobby case was prosecuted. On contraception, if you admit that it's not only an institutional position, but a position that is held by large numbers, I mean, we all know Catholics are Americans and behave like everybody else, but there are large numbers of people who do try to follow church teaching and people who don't follow it but believe it is correct. You've got a situation where religious freedom is at stake. It's not just an institution defending itself. It's an institution defending the religious beliefs of many of its followers.
Some of its followers. I think it's quite clear that there are many Catholic clergymen who would tell Roman Catholics that there is no problem of conscience in
Yeah.
and so it's not a matter of
Yes, but
not following what they believe. They don't believe it, really.
Well, and the religious beliefs of all those people are protected in our constitutional system. But along with them, you've got to protect the people who think that they should not participate in providing contraception. And that will be the issue in some of the cases that involve Catholic groups. But again, I mean, as a lawyer who's involved in this litigation, I would say the gravamen of this overly broad regulation, this unnecessary regulation, was abortifacient drugs. That's what really is. But the principle is the same when it comes to people who have religious beliefs about contraception, whether they're Catholic or not. It's hard to see a compelling governmental interest and the least restrictive means in interfering with people to believe as they choose about that.
Thank you.
Well, thank all of you very much. I'm so honored.